everybody, and welcome back to my channel. My name is Claire Fraze, and I am an award-winning author that makes videos on this channel sharing actionable writing tips that helped me make my own writing better. It's been a couple of weeks since I've published a video, and the main reason for that is because I was really busy finishing the fourth book in my series. It's called They Hunt. I just sent it to the proofreader last week and am exhausted, but the book is done, and this is the longest book I've ever written, and it took me 10 million years to actually reach the end of the book. And so because it took me 10 million years, I didn't have a chance to film. The second reason why I took a little hiatus is because of this little guy. I just adopted a new puppy. His name is Coda, and I'm kind of obsessed with him. He has been a lot of work to take care of. He is a rescue, and he's 7 months old. He is a total love bug, and if you hear any pit-pattering around this room while I'm filming this video, it's because he doesn't like being left alone. So that's where we're at right now. Right? I love him. I'm obsessed with him. I've only had him for 3 weeks, but it has been very time-consuming and very attention-grabbing taking care of a puppy, and so that is another reason why I haven't really been able to sit down and film. Oh, hi! But I'm sitting down now, and I wanted to make an update video just talking a little bit about my process for finishing the fourth book in my series, just kind of walk you through what challenges and things that I faced when writing this book because every single book that I write is a little bit different, and I always encounter some slightly different things every time I write a book, so I just like to share about that every time I finish one. But all in all, I think I'm the least stressed I've ever been about a book launch, ever. I was nowhere near as stressed writing this book and finishing this book as I was finishing They Whisper and They Return. I mean, it was still stressful just because it was so much longer than I was expecting it to be, and I was really pressed up against my schedule when I was writing They Return and freaking out for the month before that book came out because I was still making huge rewrites. 2 weeks before the book came out, I cut all of these words out and I was trying to fix it. I just felt like I was desperately trying to get to the end of that book and doing everything I could just to reach the end and get something that was good enough. And because of that, I reflected on that experience and decided that I was going to give myself more time in the future. And I did give myself more time for this book. I gave myself a lot more time, but I also ended up writing 50% more book. Hello. You're such a good boy. I know, you're such a good boy. I also ended up writing 50% more book, and so I was still pressed up against my schedule and still freaking out about stuff, but at this point, all the stuff that I was freaking out about this time is stuff that I've seen before and that I've dealt with before, so I just feel generally the pressure in my chest is just not as intense as it has been, and I just feel like I can roll with the punches a little bit better, and I don't feel like the stakes are as high because with They Return, I was like, oh, what if I don't have a perfect book on release day? And it seemed like it was the end of the world. But now I'm like, if it's absolutely not perfect, I can just update the files right after release day. It's not that big a deal. So I started writing this book in March. I finished They Return in late January, and it was just one of the most stressful publishing experiences of my entire life. And so after that was done, I was just I don't want to even think about another book project for a little while. And so I did a bunch of other things on my list and outlined different novellas and set up my Shopify store and revamped my mailing list and did all of these things in the month of February and the first half of March before I started really thinking about They Hunt. And I started writing They Hunt in mid-March. I think I spent about 2 weeks on the outline. What I like to do, my first step with coming up and starting to flesh out a book project, is to get out my giant whiteboard and just write story arcs on the giant whiteboard. And so I'll if you have been a subscriber to my channel for a while, gosh, this is such a casual video. If you've been a subscriber to my channel for a while, you'll know that I really like doing these kind of plot arcs where every single arc has a beginning, middle, and end, and the arc line corresponds to time in story and also level of tension and conflict. So I spent about 2 weeks just on the whiteboard. I would sketch out all these different arcs. The first arcs that I did were my main series arcs. So I got really clear about where I wanted the series to end before writing book 4, because this is the last book that I had before writing book 5 and the final conclusion. I just wanted to make sure I had everything set up the way I wanted it to be set up for the ending. The next thing I outlined were my character arcs, and I wanted to figure out where I wanted all of my characters to end up at the end of the series, because book 4 was my second to last ability to like get them all set up for where I wanted them to end. I needed to figure out how book 4 functioned to move their arcs. I did this for all the main relationships. I did this for Jonah and Shiloh's relationship. I did this for Francesca and Evangeline's relationship. In my first draft, I had a new love interest for Miles that I ended up cutting because of length, but that love interest is going to make an appearance in book 5. But I outlined their relationship too, like in books 4 and 5, which now will just be like, you know, she's not going to be as fundamental of a part of his character arc. I ended up replacing her with Shiloh in the entire book, and so I ended up doing a friendship arc for Shiloh and Miles, because I was like, I just feel like the two of them have a lot of stuff they have to work through. And I loved how the book took shape when I took out Miles's love interest and replaced her with Shiloh. Obviously, like, not in a romantic context or anything, just like the scenes that Miles did with that love interest, he ended up doing with Shiloh instead. And so they got a lot closer in this book, which wasn't part of my original draft, but now I'm going down a tangent. Once I had all of these arcs figured out, and only once I figured out like how I wanted all the characters to end in book 5, then I went back and I did a general preliminary arc of book 4. And I figured out where I needed it to end, because I had to figure out how I wanted book 4 to lead into book 5. And at the beginning, obviously, I already knew how book 3 ended, so I knew how they were all starting this book. So I knew I had point A and I had point B, and so I had to figure out how they got from point A to point B. And the way that I always figure this out, because it's a pretty daunting task, is doing this like thing on the whiteboard. So I will just do really, really big scenes that I know have to happen. So I'll figure out like, this is the general conflict of the book. This is where the conflict generally starts. This is where the midpoint kind of is, like the big shift. This is where like what the climax is and when the climax happens, and any major scenes and turning points that I have within that. Because I have such a large cast in this series now, and each of them have such detailed character arcs and things that they're going through, it always is a bit of a challenge to tie all of that into one outline. So I always try to like color code it and write all of my main plot stuff, like the main goal of the entire book, in black, and then I'll have like other characters in different colors so I can just see what's kind of going on with them. And once I have all the big scenes, and I'm talking really big picture stuff, that's when I start boiling it down and putting stuff into little scenes and try to figure out what different things could happen between these giant scenes that I've put on the arc. And at this point I'm just brainstorming, so I will just write any scenes that I think could happen somewhere in the book. I don't even know necessarily where, but I will just write down ideas for scenes and things that I think would be important in moving the characters forward in some way. And then I'll start putting those post-it notes on my whiteboard and start trying to visualize it that way and see how everything just kind of looks to me visually. Once I feel like I have a general arc, like a decent number of plots and scenes for every single character and subplot and main plot, only then is when I transfer everything into a plot grid. My plot grids change a lot between drafts. My plot grid for my rough draft is vastly different from the plot grid for my final draft, and I go through probably around 4 plot grids every time I write a book. So because I've done this a couple of times now, I go into this process knowing that my original plot grid is not going to be the final version of this book, and that there are a lot of things that are going to change. I really struggle, especially in the early stages, still with perfectionism, especially coming off of another writing project, like coming off of They Return. I was really happy with how that book turned out, and I just loved the way that it was written, and I loved the way that I told the story and the way that I plotted it. And so I had been listening to the audiobook to proof it, and I'd been reading it, and that was really fresh in my mind. So going straight from that into drafting a book where everything is all over the place and things aren't the final versions of themselves that I want them to be, that can be really overwhelming and frustrating. I think that was the biggest challenge that I faced at the beginning of this process, was just trying to compartmentalize and be like, it's okay that this book is not as sharp as the previous one now. It's not supposed to be now, and I have to stop holding it up to the same standard, because by the time They Hunt was published, it had gone through so many rounds of editing and reading and tweaking and stuff. So that was a challenge. And so I put everything that was on my sticky notes and on my little whiteboard outlines into the plot grid, and the way that I like to structure my plot grids looks a little bit like this. I always have a column for the main plot and then columns for every single subplot, and so because I like to color code my different arcs, it's easy for me to slot in where like point of view subplots go, like with the different colors of my post-it notes. I've gotten kind of a system going that I like. So I put everything into the plot grid, and then it's easy for me to see where all of the holes are in this subplot, because I might just have, 4 or 5 scenes in a particular subplot, but there could be giant gaps in between them. So I try to figure out how to fill those gaps, and not necessarily with scenes themselves. It could just be like little beats within larger scenes that are about something else entirely. I tend to go a little bit harder with how many things I fill out in my plot grid. Like, I will put way too many scenes in my plot grid, and then when I go to draft a book, my drafts are 10 million words long. So that's a challenge and something that I'm needing to work on. But once I had a plot grid that was pretty fleshed out, I just sat down and I started writing the book. I dictated a lot of this draft, and that was one of my goals for 2023, was like learning how to dictate, and I am happy that I made some strides. I don't find it anywhere near as comfortable as typing, and I find that dictating is a little bit frustrating when I work from home with my partner, and because we share an office, I can't dictate when he's in the same office as me. So I would need to like be in a studio kind of by myself when dictating, and on days he went into the office, this was a lot easier, but that was a little bit of a hurdle. Like, I would need to control my environment better, otherwise it was also really easy to get distracted when dictating. So dictating, I dictated a lot of the draft, it went really well, but I still prefer typing, and typing is just easier to do. I ended up typing a lot more of this book than I dictated, especially because I find it impossible to edit while dictating. Like, I need to be able to type everything out, but it was helpful as a drafting tool. I ended up doing the same thing with this draft that I did with They Whisper and They Return, which is write everything all the way up to the climax and then not write the climax, because then I have to go back and edit the book up to the climax because the climax won't make sense anymore. The climax changed a lot between my original conception for the book and the ending of the book, which was very different from my experience doing They Return, because They Return's climax was just locked in from the beginning and I knew exactly what was going to happen. So this was a little bit daunting, and that is also something that made me doubt myself early on, because I love They Return. It's my favorite out of the series, and I didn't want this one to fall flat compared to They Return. And I was like, maybe the reason that They Return was so strong in my eyes was because I had the climax all nailed in, but I don't think that's the case anymore. I'm really proud of this book and really happy with this climax too. It's got different vibes, but I think it's good for different books in a series to have slightly different vibes. Like, They Returns was much more slasher horror, gory, gross, and They Hunt is more like the Conjuring, poltergeist, ghost, kind of Ghostbusters type climax. So I wrote all the way up to the climax, and then I was running short on time just because it was so long that I started with my editor right after my first draft this time, and I went back and did all of my big rewrites to the book while I was working with my editor. I was lucky enough to know the new direction that I wanted to take the book while I was working with him, so I had this plan, and I would take chapters from my first draft, do all of my edits to them, and then send them to him. But my big giant plan was not as locked in as I would have liked it to be before starting with him, but because of my timeline, I had to kind of scrunch up the stages of the process, because ideally, if I was swimming in time and not trying to do this fast, and I'm trying to do this fast, I would lock in my first draft, do a full second draft, maybe do a third draft, and once it was like perfect, in my opinion, then I would start working with my editor. But then on the same side, like, my editor often has a lot of insight into the way that I'm writing the book and plotting the book that is very helpful and that can change the course of the story. So I do like this kind of organic process that we have where we bounce things back and forth. Because this required a lot of thinking on my feet, I ran into a lot of obstacles during this process, and I would hit these walls where I was like, oh, I wrote myself into this corner, oh, I'm gonna have to change something fundamental about the scene and just move on from it. So with They Hunt, the way that it really worked was that my editor would read a chapter, I would read it, we would move on, and then a couple days later I would make a big change to the manuscript because I'd realized some sort of fundamental issue with my plan, and then I'd realized that a chapter a couple of days before, like a chapter we did a couple days ago would have to change. And so I would make a note to myself and then keep going and writing the manuscript thinking that that's already what I did. And so I had kind of a confused editor because I'd be like, just pretend that this is the case from now on. So he was like trying to juggle it and I was trying to juggle it and it became like a little bit confusing. So I think next time I'm going to give myself a little more time. But the length of this book really ran away from me. It was 100,000 words halfway through, like even longer than they return. So it just took so long to feel like I was getting through it. And that meant that I was like working with him doing one chapter every day or like one chapter every couple of days, depending on like stuff that was going on in our lives. It took all summer. So we were sending a chapter back and forth from like beginning of June to end of like early September, actually. It was like the first week of September we were able to finish. And after we were done, I had this huge manuscript that was, I think, 180,000 words and maybe 700 comments to myself in the margins saying like, change this later after we're done, and reconciling all these things. And so that was super overwhelming. So in early September, I made a like Notion editing sheet for myself and wrote down all of the giant subplots that needed changing, and I would go through them like as fast as I could, and as fast as I could without compromising on quality. Like I would spend a couple of days fully dedicated to one specific subplot and making sure that all of that was ironed out throughout the entire manuscript before moving on to the next one. So it was just me and the manuscript for about a month and a half, and then on my calendar I was like, I need to be done editing the book and doing everything I need to do to it by the end of October, because I got the puppy on October 27th, and that ended up not happening. I got the puppy and I still had maybe 20 chapters to go back and read. Well, I did all of my edits to the book, but then I like to do one pass all the way through because I didn't do that with a return, and so many things slipped through when I sent out my arcs. So I wanted to read it start to finish and like go through it really diligently myself before sending it out. But because the book is so long, it took me a long time to do that. Also, the book was really long and I wanted to cut it down before sending it to the proofreader and before having my cover designer go in and design the paperback and hardcover wraps. So I ended up doing that. I cut 20,000 words out of the book. Everything was great, but I ran 2 weeks behind my original schedule because I did nothing, because now I take care of this dog and my entire life revolves around this puppy, which is fantastic and I love it. And it's like the perfect stress detox from being really worried about the book. That is why my arcs are 2 weeks late. And for a second, I thought that maybe I wouldn't send out paperback arcs this year because I was like, I just got the puppy. I don't know if I'm going to be able to handle doing that. I'm 2 weeks late behind on the printer. But then because, I'm so kumbaya and zen now, I was like, oh, I'm just going to move the review deadline back by 2 weeks and it doesn't really matter. That way we can still have paperback arcs and the book can be finished and I can be happy with it and there doesn't have to be all of this stress. So that's where we are right now. The book is with my ARC team. It is with the proofreader. I am doing absolutely nothing to it until I get it back from the proofreader. It comes out in 3.5 weeks. I'm going to go through and do a couple of little word searches and just trim some of the things like the buts and the I feels and the filter words and things that I want to trim from it before it comes out. But I'm not doing that until it comes back from the proofreader, just to minimize headache, because I don't want to have to reconcile all the changes. I just want to be able to go through and accept the stuff that the proofreader caught and then make my changes to the same document. And that was my general process for writing this book. I would say that the main thing that I learned writing this book is that it's not that serious. Writing is fun. It should be fun and playful and silly and exciting and doesn't have to feel like it's the end of the world all the time. I would just wind myself up in these just pressure spirals where I just feel like the world is gonna end if I didn't meet a deadline and if I didn't have everything be exactly perfect for a book launch. And I don't think things have to be. I don't think we as creatives need to put that much pressure on ourselves, because when we put ourselves in a pressure cooker, our creativity gets shut down. I felt like it was so much easier for me to come up with original ideas and to enjoy the story that I was telling when I didn't feel like the world was crumbling around me and I was failing all the time. Obviously, this is easier said than done. Obviously, I am still a perfectionist and put pressure on myself, but I found that this whole process was just generally so much more enjoyable once I stopped putting that kind of life or death pressure on myself. The second thing I learned is take the time you need to write the book. The book, once it's published, is like that forever. your publishing schedule, like it's great if you can do a book a month or a book every 3 months, and that's how you're building your brand and your career. I am honestly super jealous. But I'm a slower writer, and the difference between publishing a book after 9 months and publishing a book after 10 months or 11 months is not enormous. And so I would rather take the time that I need to create a book I'm really proud of that's going to look like that forever than to rush the process and put out something that's not as strong as it could be just because I'm trying to shave a couple of weeks off of my schedule. It's not worth it in the long run. It's just silly. It makes sense to take the time that you need in order for you to not be as stressed about it and to write the book that you actually are super proud of and you're really happy with. Another thing that I learned during this book was just that I got a little bit more comfortable understanding what stages I go through when I'm writing. So every single time when I start writing a book, I am always overwhelmed by just the size of the undertaking. I'm overwhelmed because the prose doesn't feel as polished as the one before it, and I'm always just a little bit frazzled. And then I start hitting my stride when I do my second go around. And when I do my final read through, I'm like, wow, I'm God's gift to creative writing. I am so talented. And then as soon as I send it off to my ARC team, I'm like, oh, it's crap. I really hate it. And it's terrible. So I go through these different phases, and these are normal phases. And this does not feel as overwhelming to me because I can recognize these feelings like, oh, hi, okay, I know where I am now. I felt like this before at this exact same time in the process. So just because you feel like something is absolute crap when you're writing it does not mean it's actually absolute crap. It can just be your brain tricking yourself into thinking that because it's just that time in the process when people are actually going to start reading it and you're worried about that. But you've heard me say it on here before, you'll hear me say it again, persistence, persistence, persistence. You have to persevere and be persistent when writing books. You don't want to quit halfway through the book or you're not going to have a polished, finished book. You need to just keep showing up one day after the other, even when it feels like the book is so long it will literally never end. I've never written a 180,000 word book before. That is so long. It's so much longer than anything I'd ever written before, and it really did feel like a slog in the middle. So that was overwhelming, but because I just kept showing up, I'm just gonna have like a 600 page paperback that I'll be able to do the little flippy fan thing through, and all the pages can look beautiful, and I can be like, look at how thick that is, I wrote that, and rub it in everybody's face. I didn't feel that book 4 was like a standout in terms of writing a series. Like, it wasn't drastically different from writing a book 3, but it did fit into a different part of the arc. Because I'm writing a 5-book series, each of the books falls along that kind of story arc. Like, book 1 is at the beginning, book 2 is like leading up to the midpoint, like in the rising action. Book 3 is the midpoint. Book 4 is the kind of crescendo right up to the series climax, like the second half of the rising action, and then book 5 is the series climax. So understanding that shaped the way that I approached book 4. I approached it as like, this is my launch pad into book 5. I still need to make it really exciting on its own and give it something that's completely different and give it a little bit of pizzazz, but that all of the things, like the characters had to do all the things that they had to do in order to be set up for where I wanted them in the whole series climax. And you kind of need to know your series climax when writing the book right before it so you know how to set it up. So I definitely recommend doing some big picture plotting and understanding what role every single book plays in your series and plotting it down from there, because that was super helpful to me. But there you go, there's my rambly video reflecting on writing book 4 of my series. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, make sure to like it and also subscribe to my channel. I usually make videos focused more on writing tips and writing advice that I personally found helpful when learning how to write. But today was a little bit more of an informal catch-up sesh and debrief on everything that I learned when writing this book. And an introduction to my new puppy, because he's really cute. I put him in here while I was filming with all of these bones and toys and things, and he likes to bury his food, and 2 days ago I gave him a cod skin treat, and he had decided to shove that into his bed, and while I was filming, he dug that out of his bed instead of playing with all of the soundless toys and things that I gave him, and has been crunching on that and chewing on that for the past like 20 minutes. It's the loudest thing in the world, and I'm so sorry. I anticipate book 5 of this series being just as long, if not longer, than this one, so I'm going to give myself some extra time when prepping and writing that book, I'm not going to push for it. I was originally going to push for an October release next year. I still might push for that and just see how it goes. Because this is the big finale, I don't want to stumble with the ending. I really want to stick the landing, and I have some things to iron out in how I'm going to get there. Like, I know the ending and I know my setup, but I have to figure out how to get from point A to point B. And I think writing this final book in the series is going to be pretty emotional because I've been with these characters for so long, and I've never really written an ending before. I've always written cliffhanger endings. I've never written an ending where everything is tied up in a bow, and I'm nervous about that, but I feel like I've set everything up, and I've been so thoughtful about figuring out where they're all going to end up and why, that hopefully I'll be fine. Except for one character. This one character's ending's still a little bit up in the air. I generally know what happens to them in broad strokes, but the details are up in the air. So I gotta figure out where their story takes me through book 5. But yeah, like and subscribe. I'll have a more writing tips heavy video for you next time. And I hope you have a good week. And as always, happy writing. It's been a little while since I've said that. I almost forgot.
Hi, Menace. Are you gonna go chew on your fish skin to show everybody? I've been talking about you all video. You're very cute with your little head tilt. Yes, you are. I love you, buddy.